How do we make and multiply disciples around the block and around the world? With hosts Doug Lucas of Team Expansion, Lee Wood of One Body Church, John Hirima of Big Life, Roger Shull of E3 Partners, and special guests from around the world, we'll explore how believers can come together to make more disciples. Welcome to the More Disciples podcast.
Here again with another episode of the More Disciples podcast. My name is Roger Shull. I am one of the co-hosts here alongside Doug Lucas.
Good morning.
Lee Wood.
Great to be together again.
And subbing in for John Hirima is Neil Karsten.
Hello.
Yeah, Neil's a friend of the show, so our avid listeners should recognize Neil. But our guest today is Louie Constantino, which I love that name. Right when I heard it, I was excited. So I know it's going to be a good podcast today. But Lee, why don't you introduce us to him?
Doesn't Louie Constantino, I think boxer, right? And in this corner. I have mad respect for Louie Constantino, Tara, his wife, and his whole family, because they are legitimately pursuing that as image bearers from their homes, multiplying disciples and churches from Topeka, Kansas. And we're honored to have him on the podcast. He's been the pastor of Grace Community Church, 25 years, pursuing a hybrid model of both and, not either or, from his household, in his neighborhood, with his family, as parallel streams. And inside of the podcast, we'll be talking about a simple tool we're using that's either a leadership cell or a launch group to actually see multiplying disciples and churches as a movement strategy, as a tool. So really thrilled to have my friend on, and I'm so encouraged by his faithfulness. Really, really encouraging for Louie and Tara, and you'll learn his kids' names. They've been a super blessing to us here in Tampa.
Well, Louie, why don't you introduce us to yourself? Like, how'd you get started in ministry? How'd you start pursuing disciple-making movement principles where you're at? Yeah, just introduce us to yourself.
Really excited to be on today. Thank you. And Lee's been just a great mentor for me over the last couple of months, and just really a privilege to meet him. I have been a believer for 30 years this August. I was just turning 19 when I put my trust in Christ. Grew up in Topeka, Kansas. Not a bad kid growing up, but, sometimes normal's not that great either, So when I met this pretty young lady, her dad happened to be the pastor of a church. And a year later, I was in Bible college. And so I went to Bible college for 4 years. Got out, came back home to the church that I was saved, baptized in, married in. And then a couple of years later, my father-in-law and I started this church that we're at. I did youth ministry for 19 years before he retired. About 6 years ago, I took over as pastor. Getting into the disciple-making side of things, I really found that for probably about 8 years ago, I think is when it really started. I read the Master Plan of Evangelism, and something in there, I was trying to read about evangelism, but all I kept hearing about was discipleship in it. And something really started to put a bug in me, and I was like, are we making disciples? And I couldn't answer that with a yes. I thought we were making converts, and we were making moral people, but I'm not sure we were making disciples. And so that bugged me for a while. When I took over as pastor 6 years ago, kept the status quo going, and then we had kind of a bad situation happen here at the church. But shortly after that, COVID happened, and then that allowed me to really kind of dig in and discover more about what disciple making really was in the context for how we were going to do it here. It took about 2 years to study a lot about that, read a lot, do a lot of webinars, podcasts, whatever, connect with people. And then Lee and I have family in Tampa area, and so I messaged him out of the blue in December and said, hey, I don't know. This may sound like I'm a creep or whatever, but I heard you on a podcast, and I want to know if I can take an hour of your time to have breakfast with you. So not knowing whether or not I was a serial killer or anything, he said, hey, come on over to my house. I'll make you breakfast. So me and two of my sons went over, had breakfast, hung out for an hour. And then starting first this year, he's led me in some training that's really, I feel like, turned the corner for me in a lot of ways. And I'll talk about that a little bit more later. But I really think that within what he has been able to be for me is what I think we're missing in a lot of the discipleship process that I had gotten, which is time and proximity. Even though we're not really in proximity to one another, we do spend time with each other almost 2 hours a week. And he just lets me ask him a ton of questions. I feel like sometimes we try to do things in big contexts, and it's just not the same as doing things one-on-one. So anyway, that's my journey to here, a short version of it anyway. So
Louie, I really have heard several people talk about this book by Robert Coleman, Master Plan of Evangelism, the way it took them from kind of the entry level of wanting to know more about evangelism to a higher level of discipleship. For a listener that might be hearing this podcast maybe for the first time, and they might be wondering, well, what is it? What does it mean, DMM strategy? Would you just take a moment as from your particular context and explain what might you be doing differently now than you were doing before, when you were kind of in the regular mode of the way a North American pastor functioned prior? What are you thinking about differently, and what are you doing differently now, in case somebody's listening for the first time, Louie?
That's a great question. There have been a lot smarter people than me that have articulated this better, but I'll give it a shot, right? I think that for me, what probably needed to happen the most was not that I needed to adopt a new system necessarily about how tools are great, but it wasn't necessarily a system of tools and some sort of point-by-point strategy on making disciples. It really started with me. I had to get to a point where I had to put my pride down enough to say, I am not a disciple myself. I am not in the Word. And when I say enough, I don't know if that's the right way to say it, because it's not like there's a glass that's full enough. I just wasn't putting in the proper time in the Word, in prayer, and then just one-on-one with people. I think that what I had to do, and this is still an ongoing process that I just have not conquered or anything, but like I had to get to a point where I had to say, look, my main job is not to get on stage once a week and say, I'm going to do this process where I'm going to disciple 200 people at once by giving them this message and then cross my fingers and hope that they become disciples. Because what I realized after about 4 years of that, it's not working for me. I'm not good enough of a communicator to do that. And even if I was, I just don't think it's the right way to do it. I think that's a part of it. And I never want to take away the fact that it's a part of a healthy diet of becoming a Christ follower. But for me, I had to start with myself, and I had to be real honest. I had to kind of go from, hey, am I trying to be, in order to be successful in ministry, do I need to create a good Twitter presence? Do I need to have my own, do I need to be working on my own book? I had to take all of that focus off myself. And I had to come to a point where I was like, what if nobody ever knows my name? What if nobody even in this city ever, besides the 5 people that I'm working with, the few that I'm pouring deeply into, what if nobody ever knows my name? And I think once I got to that point, man, there was like a freedom in that. And I can almost get emotional about it because it just was a big mental change for me.
Louie, obviously you've been a pastor, you said, for the past 25 years.
Well, I did youth ministry for 19, yeah, and then 6 as the lead pastor. But I'm sorry,
that's awesome.
But in youth ministry, I got a chance to really do one-on-one stuff with kids. I mean, we were just with kids all the time. But when I don't know, in a lot of other people's context too, you step into adult ministry and all of a sudden it's hands off. Everybody's busy. Everybody's going and doing their own thing, and so we just go, well, everybody's busy, so we'll just try to work within that context. I just think that you sacrifice for the things that are important. Everybody's busy, but you just gotta, I don't want to sound too harsh. Lee always says to me, oh, Louie, you're the one who's being nice. I'm the one who's always too harsh on stuff. But I feel like sometimes the things that I've learned at this point are so exciting to me. I really want to pass them on. And I even prayed before I got into this. I don't want to sound critical towards where I came from, because it took me a while to get here. And I can't forget that I was once in that boat. And I don't want to put anybody down who's God's still working on their heart. They're trying to get there too, you know. I'm sorry if I stepped on your question there, Neil.
No. That's great. So give us a little bit of the lay of the land right now. What is this? You know, you're coming from that framework of much more just your typical sorts of church as we would know it. Sounds like you're stepping more and more into this intentional disciple making and multiplying. Give us the landscape. Give us the lay of the land. What's this looking like for you? How is this unfolding?
I feel like where we're at right now, and I say that very purposefully because 2 years from now, it may look a little different. I feel like this is kind of always evolving as I'm trying to get better at it and learn from it. But right now, what we've been doing is I feel like I've transitioned from just looking at what we do within the four walls of the church as programs to keep people busy or to keep them within their, you know, people groups, whether it's not a men's group, women's group, whatever. That instead of looking at those things just programmatically, what I'm trying to do is everything that we're doing within the prevailing model church, I want to move people towards having rhythms of a disciple. And so what that means is that our small groups we still have small groups in the context of our church. We did not try to just make our small groups into micro churches because they're just not the same thing. And so what we did instead is say, hey, I think what the key to me on this, when a light really went on here for me was that I had to go, okay, no offense to the people, the wonderful people in this congregation here at Grace Community Church that have been supporting me for 20 years. But there are a lot of Christ followers who are spiritually asleep. And they are great moral people and they're wonderful folks. But when you get to talking about what Christ wants you to do, the Great Commission, ultimately all of the purpose in life for every believer, that concept for some sounds a little foreign. And when you introduce that to them, they're like, whoa, I didn't sign up for this. Well, part of that was our fault because we taught them to be consumers. You know, as a prevailing model pastor, I kind of taught that. And so now to switch gears on them, I feel like the first thing that I wanted to do, I know a buzzword right now is deconstruction, right? Everybody's talking about deconstruction. And when you go through that process of deconstructing, you get out on the other end, or you're kind of coming out on the other end of that, and you just want everybody else to be where you're at mentally. And it didn't happen quick with you, and it's not going to happen quick with other people either. So instead of me getting very frustrated with people that I felt like I was like, come on. When I first was trained in DMM, I just wanted the whole church to go through it. Now, you guys are probably very familiar that that's a terrible idea. That's just a terrible idea. I mean, to force everybody into that, that's a great way to dishearten people, right? And so instead of being frustrated with people not moving fast enough, I've been like, you know what? God has not called me out of this. I'm still here. He wants me to try to see some of these sheep that are asleep to wake up. And so instead of our small groups being a central focus of being community, we've made it discipleship. Now, quite frankly, because of that, we've lost a few people in those groups. Because we're trying to say, hey, we're just going to call for more obedience in prayer, more obedience in Bible reading, more obedience in in our conversations that we have, not just having a sermon-based discussion question, which I'm not trying to put that down either. You understand, but let's wake up to what God is calling us to do. My job is not to tell you what God called you to do. My job is to teach you to hear God, how he's calling you.
Amen.
I don't want to raise up a bunch of people to be just like me. I want to raise up people who can hear God call them into their unique context, whether that be working with people of special needs, having a ministry where like a workout type of gym thing that, Lee's got some of that stuff going on. That's really neat. I'm trying to really see that kind of thing happen. Okay. So I say all that to say that, what's taken place then over the last year and a half is that slowly some people start to kind of rise, you see some people waking up and you hear it in their different stories and it gets really exciting for me. And I'll tell you one real quick. And this may sound like no big deal at all, but I had a lady in our church. She told me a couple of weeks ago, I was at a basketball practice for my kids And I thought to myself, I'm going to put my phone down because nothing says I don't want to talk to anybody like holding my phone up. And she said, well, after sitting in these conversations that we've had, I just decided that maybe God wants me to talk to the people around me. So she puts her phone down. I said, well, what happened? She goes, well, by the end of the night, the family that was next to me invited my family over to their house for dinner next weekend. And I just go, man, to me, that is huge. That I know that doesn't sound like a big deal to too many people. And that doesn't sound like having some special speaker come to your church or some dudes that rip phone books in half come to your church and 2,000 people put their trust in Christ or whatever it may be. But it's so big because in her heart, she heard God telling her, care about the people that are sitting right next to you. And she said, I'm a huge introvert. And that was a big step for me. And so when she told me that, I said, you don't realize how happy that makes me. And if I see just a few, 2 or 3 of those people hear that, and then we can train them up, that's super exciting for me. Oh, and then one other thing, something that I've heard Lee say a lot, and it's really hit me, is that I don't even know, like terminology wise, what you would consider us. Like we can say hybrid or whatever. I like the way that Lee says that there's like parallel streams, because like we're doing this traditional model church, but I'm kind of doing the disciple making almost off to the side, you know? Like I do this, no disrespect, but I do the traditional model church a lot of the time is my tent making in some ways. And, and then sometimes then what happens is the people who kind of come out of that, who are waking up from that, I'm saying, hey, we have got great things that we can do to show you how God wants to take you out to be a disciple maker and take you out of these 4 walls. And we're ready for that.
That's hilarious.
And I hope that doesn't sound disrespectful to anybody. So
no.
Well, what I hear is you are trying to find the few that you can pour into. You know, I mean, that's what you just said. One thing I'm curious about is in that process, like, how did you go about choosing the people that you were like, these are going to be the people that I want to share this with. These are the people that I want to train on these things that I'm learning, that I want to pursue in these ways. How did you end up choosing those people in your church?
See, that's a wonderful.
Or did they choose you?
Well, that's a wonderful question, because what I think I did wrong at first was I wanted everybody to do it. But then I thought I cast a little less wide of a net. And I was like, well, how about all of these people then? And then that was kind of too wide of a net. After a while, what I've kind of done is I've just presented some things. Our biggest context, we really only do 2 things at our church for the most part. We have Sunday morning, and then we do our small groups. And we have some other things that kind of build community, like potlucks, that normal kind of stuff. But within our small groups, when you start to have conversations with people that are for the first time reading their Bible on a regular basis, praying on a regular basis, then starting to engage in some stuff like listening prayer or prayer walking or whatever it is, they just kind of come to the surface. They start telling you some stories. Also, I found that one of our greatest commodities is storytelling, because, I mean, think about it. Our favorite movies, our favorite, books, we're all just compelled by story. And so when I tell some stories about things that are happening in our neighborhood or elsewhere about how God's using us, then the people whose ears kind of, you can tell they're kind of just waking and they're like, oh, wow, I could do that. I could totally do that. When you couple that with this prayer that we've been praying consistently for 2 years now to just join God where he's already at work, I mean, he's just putting these people in front of us, kind of like you said, they're just kind of popping up, really. And then what's wonderful is that, but then we're just ready for them. And I feel like I'm doing a whole lot less work in that regard than I used to. Instead of trying to convince everybody and trying to have like a good sales pitch, which, by the way, becoming a disciple, this is like the worst sales pitch in the world, isn't it? Like you go to people and you just go, hey, how about this? How about you come with me, because we're going to like give all of our lives to this God that we can't see. And when you give everything to him, you turn everything over to him, then you actually might be killed for it. So come on, join this club, And people are like, when people get that, man, I'm telling you, you don't have to convince them to stay on board. You don't have, their hearts are already in it. That's sort of been how we've been doing it lately. And it has been a long process. It's taken about 2 years of me talking about this a lot and then just seeing some people kind of start to come to the surface. But I really feel like God's waking them up. It's not really me.
So I'm going to get a little bit more granular inside of that because I have been working with Lou. So what I love about Lou and Tara and their family is Lou and Tara are obeying like that parallel stream as a house church in their home. Who he's pouring into deeply every week are his two oldest sons and their families and some other people in other locations, and are basically doing the same thing. They're modeling and assisting for people in other locations, helping them to become multiplying disciples and churches and making that level of commitment and abandonment to Jesus that, okay, if it costs me my life, I'm going to engage from my household as a disciple in church. And we're sharing basically every week. He's doing basically 3/3 with those people from their homes, and they're obeying on a weekly basis. I'm super encouraged by that, Lou. So why don't you talk about what that's looked like over the last 11 weeks with Phoenix, with Bronze, and those guys that you're meeting with on Sunday nights over Zoom. Share some of those stories and what that journey has been like. And I think that'll help our viewers and listeners.
Yeah, we've been doing this thing. Well, we start at the first of the year. Lee will take me through the training earlier in the week, and then Sunday evenings, I get together with a small group of people through Zoom. 2 of them are my sons. Some of their other friends. We've got 5 different locations, 5 different cities that they're getting trained in, 3 different college campuses within that. But what we've done, I mean, I hear the practitioners of this all say the same things. And yet I feel like as practicers of it, we hear what we're being told and then we go do something else. You know, like I'll hear Lee say, okay, here's what this is. Now go do it. And then what I would do in the past is, okay, I need to go train other people to do this. It's like, no. You go do it. You go do it. What are you doing? You know, I'm like, okay, I need to really make sure that that's at the forefront of what I'm doing. I can't lead anybody where I haven't been. And so when we get to these weeks where it's like, share your story with 5 people. Well, I've been doing this for 25 years. You would think that sharing my story with people wouldn't be that big of a deal. I was a nervous wreck that week. And then the next week is, hey, not only do you share your story with 5 people, share God's story with 5 people. Oh, I was just like, I don't know if I can do this. And I know that on the surface, some people will say, well, isn't that legalism? Isn't that legalism? And you know what? It's not legalism. Here's the thing. If I was going to be a surgeon and I went to college and I studied everything there was to know about surgery, but I never picked up a scalpel, I don't know, you wouldn't want to be my first patient, right? And I know that like within this, with what Lee was telling me, I'm like, I don't want to do that. Like deep down, like, I don't want to do it, you know? And I got to lead 2 different people to Christ over the course of, I didn't do my 5 people in a week. It took me like 2 weeks, but 2 of those people came to Christ. And I'm like, man, here I've been like, you know, having these opportunities for years, and some of it was I didn't have the right tools, but most of it was just me not being obedient. I just wasn't being obedient, you know? And so once I did that, then the people that I'm leading through it, we get together once a week. We spend 45 minutes, everybody telling their stories about who they're connecting with and how we can encourage one another, and we're learning from one another. And it's incredible. It's been a wild ride. I like what I do in the church. I really do. I love the people that are here. What's going on in my neighborhood and in my disciple making stuff outside of the church is like a wild adventure. It's crazy. Wow. And it's been a lot of fun. And I sit here and I go, I just want more people to experience this, you know? It's so much fun. I don't know why we're trading in just sitting in a pew for an hour on Sunday, thinking that that's what we want out of our faith when all of this crazy fun stuff is going on outside of there?
Louie, I got to ask you, by the way, it's so exciting to hear these stories, and all of us, of course, this is like throwing gasoline on a fire. You know, we're just really with you in this, and it really means a lot. But I got to think that there are probably a couple of listeners out there somewhere, a couple of viewers who are hearing you, and they can, maybe if they're like already involved in some ministry of some kind, they're probably tempted to be involved, but their first thought is, yeah, but what will the people think that I'm supposed to be preaching to? What will my church think? And I got to ask you, of course, we ought to ask some of your church members, but the best as you can you tell a story or share what do the people in your church think of this change that's going on inside of you? I got to say, you would think that they would see that you were like invigorated by this. I can tell already, if there ever were any of us in the past that were involved in something that some people call the Imposter Syndrome, where we're involved in getting up in front and preaching, but deep down inside, we wonder if we're really doing it. You are now the exact opposite of that idea. You are sounding and you're sending us a signal that you are so authentic and genuine. So they've got to see that in you. But beyond that, are they like thinking, oh my goodness, what in the world is our church becoming? What am I signing up for? What are some of the responses you're getting from church members?
Well, to answer that question, let me go back a few years. When I was trying to just continue on the status quo with what I had stepped into, we had a wonderful church, but I'm kind of like a C+ communicator at best. And so if the pinnacle of somebody's spiritual week is my sermon, man, I feel that I'm sorry, because that's just going to be like a letdown, you know? And so after about 2 years, I would come in to this office after my sermon, and instead of telling people bye, I would sit here like this with my head in my hands, because I was like, this is too much pressure. Like, I feel like I can't live up to what they need me to be for them. And so then through some hard times that I went through, and really about a year of depression, honestly, I ended up, one day I started to lean into what we'd already been doing in our neighborhood, just really be purposeful about what we were doing with our neighbors. Now, to answer your question, though, more specific, I think at first what I wanted to do was just turn the boat completely around. And you just can't do that to people. And it's too confusing for them. And I get that now. And I probably didn't get that at the beginning. But what I instead am doing is I'm just like, you know what? I'm just going to make sure that I am just being very diligent about putting in that I'm working for this church the amount of hours that I need to be working to be a good steward of them paying me for this job. But on top of that, you know, that discipleship making stuff is on top of all of that, you know. And so then I began to ask myself a question. In ministry, what if we weren't getting paid for this? You know, 1 Corinthians 9:16 tells us that Paul's like, woe is me if I don't preach the gospel. I mean, this is just, I'm compelled to do this. And I wonder if maybe sometimes we can take a ministry job because it's a good gig and it's lucrative, and we can take our skills and we can go work in a church and just do a good job at it, but it has nothing to do with anything spiritual. And I don't mean that to be critical, but I really find that maybe there are sometimes we got to ask ourselves the real question. If I wasn't getting paid for this, would I be making disciples in my own context? Would I be making disciples in my neighborhood? And because the truth is, if I'm not currently doing that, if I'm a pastor of a church and I don't know the names of my neighbors, man, something might need to change. Something might need to change. So I try to put in my full work week with the church. And then I do the discipleship stuff on top of that. And at first, man, you're right. You know, because I think at first people are just like, yeah, but I see you spending a bunch of time with your neighbors. Why don't you spend that time with us in the church? So I had to learn from that. And honestly, at the beginning of this year, I've been way more purposeful about saying, I am going to go to lunch with at least 3 people a week from our church, lunch or coffee, and we're going to have people from our church over to eat on a regular basis. so that I don't get caught up in only doing stuff outside of the church. Within APEST, I'm like firmly an evangelist. And what's interesting about that, and I never mean for this to happen, but if we were on the scene of when the Titanic sank, and I'm in the boat and I'm trying to pull people out of the water, you know, I feel like sometimes what's happened with me is like I'll pull somebody out of the water, I'll put a blanket over them, then I keep looking and I'm looking, and I'm looking out in the water, and pretty soon I get a tap on my shoulder. And they go, "Hey, can you give me another blankie? Because I'm a little cold." And I'm like, I'm looking for people out in the water, and what do you need, a sip of water? To, you know, so you hear me being a little critical. I'm sorry. And so then after a while, they're still laying in the boat. And I'm like, "Hey, would you warm up so that you can help me pull some people out of the water?" And what I realized is I was like mistreating people in some ways because I'm not very shepherding. And what I needed to do was learn how to be a better shepherd, because once I pulled people into the boat, they still needed some healing and they still needed some care.
I got to say this before Neil goes. So we get to do this. Like I meet with Lou like on Fridays. Their launch group leadership cell is on Sundays. So one of our meetings, because you guys know me on here, Doug, Roger, Neil, some of our listeners and viewers probably by now, like my gifting is not shepherd teacher either. Okay. Like I'm firmly apostolic, prophetic, and really know how to offend people. Right, Neil? Like it's a gift. So, but Lou actually commented, this is where I go, well, yay, Jesus. He actually said, "Lee, you've helped me to be a better shepherd." That was to be a better pastor. I was like, no way. I'm the farthest away from that thing that you can even imagine. But the we emerged from that in relationship as people abandoned to Jesus, as disciples in churches. And that gives me goosebumps, man. So I think you're next, Neil, but I wanted to share that, how that we actually formulates in relationship with Jesus and one another and leadership as well. So I've actually helped somebody be a better pastor. Wow. That blows my mind.
Hey, one of the things that was coming to mind for me is obviously when we talk about this stuff, typically we're talking about all the good stuff. We're talking about the stuff we're celebrating. Just a minute ago, you were saying, you know, like the sell for disciple making is a hard sell. Yeah. What have been some of the hard parts? You know what I mean? Because I think it's important that people hear that as well. So we're not, it doesn't come across like, hey, here's the get rich quick scheme in disciple making. But instead, like, what are some of the hard parts that you've been experiencing stepping into?
That's a great question. There have been a lot. But if I could put it into a picture, the movie The Matrix, when at the beginning of the movie, when he's in the Matrix, everything is orderly, but everything's very monochromatic. And then when he gets out of the Matrix, everything is very vivid in color, but it's gritty and dirty. And the reason why I think we trade in trying to disciple people 1 on 200 in a traditional church setting is because we don't have to be with people. We can get up on the stage platform and we can talk at people, but we don't really have to know them. We don't really have to do life with them. You guys know, everybody listening knows that you spend very much time with people. Everybody's crazy. We're all nuts, and everybody's got something that's a little quirky about them. And what I had to realize, and this was such a beautiful thing for me, I had to get to a point where I realized that what was driving me nuts about other people had way less to do with them than it did with me. And I had to learn how to give grace in a way that God's given me grace. And then even bigger than that, I had to learn that they're probably giving me some grace too. And there's probably stuff that I have. It's the point that I'm trying to make is when you're disciple making, it's one-on-one and it's dirty and gritty and it's hospital visits that'll break your heart to go to. It's stuff where you're sitting across the table from somebody who's struggling with meth. You're in people's lives way more. That's hard. That's really hard on your emotions. Right. It's hard because sometimes you just don't want to, sometimes you honestly, from a fleshly standpoint, you just don't want to do that. And you just kind of go, gosh, can't I just live my life? Can't I just not have to worry about other people's stuff? And then I think to myself, whenever that happens, I think, how many times has God just given me love and grace?
Amen.
Just didn't deserve any of it. So how can I not reciprocate that onto somebody else?
Wow.
So that's probably the biggest thing that I've seen. But the other thing is, it is kind of hard sometimes within the context of the church. I had great friends of mine. I still love them. No disrespect to them whatsoever. But they left the church, and one of the last things they said to me was, Louie, every week you get up and say, you talk about loving your neighbor, but sometimes we just want to come and hear uplifting message and good music. We're just tired. We've had a long week. And I just had to go, well, I wish you the best. But a little side note, that love your neighbor stuff, I didn't make up. Like, I didn't coin that phrase, you know, and I hope that God will work them towards that more. And they're very loving people. Don't get me wrong. It's just, we've created and been a part of this system that really teaches people to just sit and take it in. Come sit, listen, leave. I mean, it's a great if that's a part of your spiritual walk, but it can't be all of it, man. It can't be.
Mm-hmm.
So,
You know, before our podcast started, we were talking a bit about how you have integrated the disciple-making principles into your church. And we were already talking about it. You mentioned the group, you know, you're training your sons and just people at the church and different things like this. But one thing we haven't really touched on as much, Lee kind of alluded to it, but Lee said that he trains you on something that you go that week and train your group that you have got together. I would love to hear more about that, because I find that sometimes when I'm trying to make a disciple or train people, you know, they feel like they need to get 10 steps ahead before they can do the one thing. But in reality, a lot of this stuff is, I can learn it this week, and because I know it now, I can do it. Like you're talking about, I can obey. And then because I'm doing it, I know how to train someone in something. And so I love to hear that, how that process has been for you, like learn something, then train it pretty quickly afterwards with your people, how that has been.
Yeah, this particular training has been exactly that. And what ends up happening is, you know, I go through the training on Friday. I take people through it on Sunday. So I don't really have sometimes an opportunity to have obeyed all of the training. I end up obeying the training along with the people that I'm taking through the training. So that's tremendous. And I will tell you, though, the group that God has given us that I'm taking through this training, man, they are exceptional, like sharp young leaders. And that was key, because they have to say yes to that. That was the biggest part. It didn't, you know, but that duckling discipleship that Lee always talks about, that's all it was. Just one step ahead is all you have to be. One of the things that, and I don't really want to switch gears on this, but this correlates with what we're talking about. One of the things that I'm doing, there's kind of twofold, is we look at our household as a church, my family as a church, and then we're inviting people into that within the neighborhood context. We have Friday night, we have some couples coming over, and we will do a discovery Bible study. It's an incredible deal. There's a friend of mine in the neighborhood who's an atheist, and he comes and he loves the discussion every week, even in those times where we really get into the gospel. There's two reasons why I do this. One is because every single day I see these people in my neighborhood. I already have a context of community with these people. And I was like, let's just be purposeful, you know, within that. And let's see if a micro church would eventually emerge out of disciples being made here in this context. I did not say, let's make a church in our neighborhood and then see if we can get people to come to it. I said, let's go try to connect with people. And if a church emerges, then so be it. We'll follow God on that. The other reason, because we wanted to reach people, one, but the second reason was because I wanted to provide a pilot group for other people to see and go, man, I could do that too. I realized really early on, I always was inspired by Andy Stanley, but I never aspired to be Andy Stanley. I mean, his type of leadership is extraordinary. Maybe, you know, 5 people in our generation will have that kind of gifting. I just don't have it. But what I can inspire people on is they can look at me and just go, oh man, I can have people over to dinner from my neighborhood. You know, I can shovel my neighbor's driveway, which that means we get snow here for those of you who live in different parts of the country.
They get a lot of snow.
So it's an easy thing. I hate shoveling snow, and so I don't do it because I like it. I only do it for ministry purposes. But but anyway, the point is, I'm doing that also as a model for other people to be able to see and do. So the training that Lee's taken me through is only like 2 days apart from the people I'm taking other training through. But then what I'm trying to do in my neighborhood, I might end up being about a year or two ahead of some of the other people that I'm taking through that. But that was important for me because I wanted to be able to lead them well in some of this stuff that was a little deeper on the details part of it.
So one thing, Roger, he doesn't lead the 3/3. All it is every week is you get it. There's a different skill, something that they're learning, that they're practicing weekly, but they're going through someone else is leading that 3/3 Discovery Bible study. We use different languages over 11 weeks. And the tool is meant for them to actually identify as disciples in churches from that. That group that's birthing that is basically, we're looking at a 3-month reproduction rate of obedient, multiplying disciples and churches, launching in 5 different geographical areas. Is that translating, Roger, like what we're saying? Because I'm a worse communicator than Lou is.
Yeah, I think what I heard you say is as Louie is doing this in his home, he's doing a 3/3 process, which is just a reproducing model of how to lead a group. And also doing Discovery Bible Study. I know sometimes people do Discovery Bible Study slightly differently, but similar process. And the people that are in that Discovery Bible Study can now lead it after even just a few months, lead the different parts, and then they can also reproduce it and are reproducing it. And it's even going to other states. So I think that's maybe coming from the training on Zoom that you're doing.
Yeah. So all it is coaching.
Did I get all that right? That's what I heard.
He calls it training. We're having a discussion. Yeah. We're talking about the next week. That's what we're doing. So it's a relational thing from Stacy and I in our home, which are the same thing that have been a home church for 9 years. That I'm talking to using actual tools instead of letters and being there. I'm doing that with him on Friday. He's doing that with 11 people on Sunday. And they're going to say, hey, we're going to die for Jesus and do this in our homes too. I think that's amazing.
That is pretty amazing. Was that
that's
Louie?
Exactly.
Summing up.
What's really funny is that Lee and I speak very similar, and I'll listen to him every week and he'll say to the guest, well, if you speak Lee, and I'm like, I totally understood everything you said every single time. So, that made sense to me.
We have some people who are like gifted in the gifts of interpretation on this podcast. So just specifically interpreting Lee, not sure about interpreting tongues, but so we have to kind of translate.
I think it could be similar in gifting. Yeah.
Yeah, that all worked out. That's exactly how it is. The big picture, the process is so simple. It really is, it's just one person taking another person, modeling, assisting, and just going through that whole thing that we learn all the time. And we just need to put in practice. And another thing, too, that we hear all the time is imitate before you innovate, right? Us pastors really struggle with that. We really do. We hear one thing and they'll say, well, what are you doing in your life? Do you know your neighbors? And the first thing that we hear is, okay, I can't wait to get a group together. I'm going to start this thing at my church. We're going to get people to sign up for it. We're probably going to have them bring some food. And then I'll train them in all this stuff. It's like, no. Do you know your neighbors? And sometimes we just don't, it's like we're just not hearing it completely. And I think I went through a couple of years worth of that as well before I was like, oh my gosh, it's right in front of me. I just need to do what I've been told.
That might be a good place to wrap up. I think you summed up a lot there. I like what you said, imitate before innovate. That's something that I know that I had to learn. Even as a new believer, it's not just pastors. I was a new believer just being like, I got the 3/3 and I was like, I can make this better. And I tried to change it and it didn't go well. So I love your honesty, Louie. I love you sharing your heart and how you have failed, what God has done, how people have come to know the Lord. Mm-hmm. I loved hearing all of it. And so many of the people we have on this podcast have great stories to share from years of implementing this. And I think you give a perspective of maybe somebody who has been implementing it less time, but it's something that will communicate to a lot of our audience who are also trying to implement right now or just starting or are thinking about starting. And so I really appreciate everything that you had to share.
Thank you.
Yeah, man. Love you, bro.
Hey, can I tell one more story? 5 months ago, I go into the dry cleaner, and the lady who's working there knows me, and I can tell that she's crying when she writes up my ticket. And I ask her what happened, and she's got these family problems going on. And so I did something this seems kind of weird, but it's almost embarrassing for me to say. I would usually take that situation and say, I'll pray for you, and then I would drive off. But I asked at that time something different than I usually did. And I said, can I pray with you right now? And I reached through the window and I held her hand and I prayed. And she looked up and she said, thanks. And I said, well, I'll be in touch. And I move on. We were able to serve her a little bit over the next couple of months. But then I went in 3 weeks ago and she was upset. And I got to talking to her, asked her if my wife and I could take her to lunch. We took her to lunch that week. And in the restaurant, I used the Two Kingdoms tool and was able to lead her to Christ in the restaurant. And I get to baptize her this Sunday. I feel like when we pray that that we could join God where he's already at work, these things just come into us. We just need to be prepared and receptive and willing to do something about it when we're presented with it. And that's really been a picture of the last few years for me. And it's been very fun and exciting.
How are you making more disciples? What problems have you encountered? What successes have you celebrated? What questions do you have? Share your stories with us by visiting moredisciples.com/contact. If you're looking for next steps on growing your ability to make and multiply disciples, visit moredisciples.com to find resources, tools, and events all designed to help you make more disciples.